Sasha, I'm so glad that you're my dialogic partner for this text because the way kingship is described here is such a traditional thing, and even linguistically, we can say so much about what's going on here. Do you have any immediate thoughts? What's the first thing that pops in your mind about that kind of inherited concept of kingship?
Well, quite a few things, Greg. And one of the aspects of this particular text that might be interesting for our readers is related to language and gender. So isn't it interesting that he's addressing Penelope,
Yes.
The epitome of female queen?
Yes.
And of course the text, faithfully to the original Greek,
Yes.
features the simile to a male king, and
That's
there are
it.
pronouns such as he and his, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So there's this interplay between the
Yes.
genders.
Yes, and that kind of works throughout the Odyssey for Odysseus and Penelope, because without Penelope, Odysseus would not be a complete hero. And in fact, you could argue that Agamemnon is an incomplete hero because he's not a match with his queenly counterpart, Clytemnestra. So
Absolutely.
I really see that, and of course it's tantalizing that Odysseus, who has not yet identified himself, is the one who's saying this to Penelope, who is notionally unaware that this is Odysseus.
Right.
But there's a lot of signaling here from the side of Odysseus.
Right. So he's just to follow up on this idea. His speech is supposed to be a speech of a beggar, and yet it is adorned with this language that is more appropriate in much more solemn context. So what I see here are the expressions like the dark earth and
Yes.
The earth producing wheat and barley. All of these are
Yes,
deeply
yes.
traditional expressions, phraseology, that is frozen units of
Yes.
language that came
Yes.
down generation from generation, and were probably millennia old
Yes.
when this notionally took place.
Yes, yes, that's
Right.
right. Yeah. And when you say frozen, I like your metaphor, but in a funny way, here they're unfrozen because they're put into action. And I'm thinking of how sometimes we talk about metaphors, and there are people who will say, that metaphor is dead. And yeah, for some person, it may be dead in one context, but it might come alive, sometimes even accidentally in another context. And so here, the metaphor of the king being the essence of good vegetation and of productivity for the earth, and the flourishing of everything, and fertility of plants and animals and humans. I'm thinking of other verbal art traditions in other Indo-European languages where we see a lot of this.
Right. And of course, there's a connection between Dikē and
Yes.
and vegetation, which is something we'll explore
Yes.
in
Yes.
other texts. In
Yes,
particular.
exactly. I'm so glad you mentioned Dikē because, as we'll see again and again and again, the Iliad and the Odyssey simply do not accentuate Dikē in the sense of justice. That kind of poetics you'll see in Hesiodic poetry, but not really in Homeric poetry. You really have to look long and hard. This is one of the few cases where you do have Dikē in the sense of justice, and it's almost un-Homeric. That's how rare it is. And when we fast forward to, let's say, hour 22 in Plato's Apology of Socrates, when Socrates keeps talking about Dikē as absolute justice and how that's represented by certain characters in Homeric epic, you say, wait a minute, it's not. But in a way it is, except that it's only in a subtext.
Interesting. Huh. That is very interesting.
And it's a hard task for anybody, including experts like us, to find really good blueprint cases of Dikē and Dikaios as justice and just in Homeric poetry. Another one we did see was in Odyssey 3, when Nestor is telling the story of the nostoi that are unsuccessful, nostos traditions, where the ending is not a happy one. And there too, it seems that if a nostos tradition is unhappy, if the ending is bad, it's because somebody was unjust. But aside from that passage in Odyssey 3 and this passage in Odyssey 19, we really have to look long and hard to find other examples.
Since we mentioned this difference between the world and language of
Yes.
Iliad and Odyssey and
Yes.
some other texts, I wanted to ask you about this Greek word in brackets, Aretē,
Yes.
which we here translate as people are meritorious.
Yes.
So is it one of these differences? Because in other
Yes.
texts, as we'll see,
Yes.
I think around hour 20, we'll see Aretē in the sense of, let's say, athletic accomplishment.
Yes.
And that might be
Yes.
how our readers have met the word before.
Yes, this is a really tough one, and I don't know whether you as a linguist subscribe to the proposed etymology of Aretē as a derivative of the verb arnumai or arnustai, in the sense of struggle or strive to reach a goal, in which case Aretē would even be the process of struggling for a goal. Even if we say that, that's still very far away from what I'm trying to convey here with the translation meritorious. But I think somehow the idea is that people strive to make a living. They strive to make the land as fertile as possible. And so they have to have good moral behavior as well as everything else to do that. And the result of all that striving is then that, I guess I was moral because, look, the vegetation is flourishing around me.
I really like this because this explains how you may need somebody's rule or somebody to be in command of this process
Yes.
as you achieve your goal.
Yes.
Which isn't the most conspicuous aspect of
No.
Aretē in the athletic sense.
No.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. But I'm glad you brought up the athletics and then the warrior activities. All of those activities are aimed at reaching some wonderful result. But in a sense, the poetics emphasizes the struggling to reach the result rather than the result itself.
This is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.